Joe Gagliano joins us on Sports Byline. At 24 years old, he organized and financed the multi-million-dollar Arizona State basketball point-shaving scandal. And to this day, it remains one of the largest known scandals in sports history. And after being indicted for the ASU scandal, he was sentenced to federal prison, struggling to get out from underneath the cloud of the ASU scandal. Upon his first release from prison, he embarked on an aggressive path to success, making millions in various businesses and real estate. However, Joe's run-ins with the law were not yet over. A few years later, the 2008 financial collapse engulfed Joe's gray area in a banking deal that landed him in prison for a second time. It was also his wake-up call. He has written a book. It is a wonderful read. It's called No Gray Areas. The book isn't just about inside details of the ASU scandal. It is Joe's personal story of greed, consequences, and redemption. I know, Joe, that you grew up in Chicago. Your dad was a police officer. And at a very young age, 13 or 14 years old, you were wheeling and dealing. Is this where all of this started?
Pretty much. I don't want to use the word wheeling and dealing in a negative sense, Ron, because I was very blessed growing up. I had a ton of opportunity given to me. Had a loving family, still have a loving family. Had opportunities for as much education as I could take on, and so it was a good environment for me. But just like anyone in this world, we are all products of our environment. And after I left college, I went to Eastern Illinois University. I went to go trade bond futures at the Board of Trade in Chicago, and was very blessed and cursed. I always say blessed and cursed in the same sentence, because it's very blessed to make a lot of money at a young age, cursed to not really appreciate how I got it. But I said we're products of our environment because I was on the floor of the Chicago Board of Trade trading bond futures. And to use the words ethical, honest trader in the same sentence is kind of a oxymoron in my mind. Because if you're an ethical, honest trader on the floor, you're really not obtaining high degrees of success in that field. So I learned early on when I was at the floor, on the floor of the Board of Trade, the age of 22, 23, 24, I learned that the gray areas in life were acceptable. And that's kind of where I drifted a little bit, Ron.
Yeah, I would also think being in that atmosphere, like you talked about, trading bonds, and also being young and making a lot of money early, you really did not have a clear focus between right and wrong, did you?
Well, I had a clear focus growing up. I mean, my father was a police officer. My parents were disciplinarians, for lack of a better word. We certainly knew values inside of our household. My older sister, my younger brother, we were definitely taught right from wrong. But at the young age of 22, 23, when I started making money, and my father was an entrepreneur. After he left the police force, he opened up a security company back in Chicago and started doing pretty well. And he was an uneducated man, never went to college. My grandfather was off the boat from Italy. So those were the role models that I looked up to, and I knew I never wanted to really work for anyone else in corporate America. And so, it was, I'm going to show them, and I'm going to do it bigger and better than them. So I really, that's, gets back to where I said I drifted, because I did know right from wrong. We did have values in our household. It's just, I thought I can do it differently.
Where did you jump over to gambling? Where did that jump come from?
Well, I'll tell you what, being on the floor at the CBOT, if you're a trader down there, Ron, 9 times out of 10, you have a vice. And the vices down there that seem to be pretty popular are either gambling or drugs. Me, I've, still to this day at 47 years old, I've never done a drug in my life. But down at the CBOT, I certainly learned how to gamble.
When you say gambling, what type of gambling was it?
Well, mainly it was sports betting up front, but you'd walk on the trading floor with a pocket full of cash, and you'd play liar's poker during downtime. you'd gamble on pretty much anything you could think of down there, and you'd walk off the floor with no money or more money than you went on the floor with. And that was just kind of what I got used to. That was kind of like my norm. But mainly it was sports betting, Ron. That's where I learned the intricacies of sports, the gambling lines, the betting lines, the ways to middle games, and the way to pick winner.
How did you get credibility at 23, 24 years old?
Well, credibility in what sense, Ron?
Well, I mean, you went into something like gambling, sports gambling, and, to be that young, usually somebody like that would not have a lot of credibility, especially with the veteran gambler, and you were awfully successful at it. I mean, what you did with the scandal at Arizona State was something that was sophisticated to a great degree. I don't think it probably was as sophisticated as you maybe wanted it to be because you got caught in it, but that's what I'm talking about.
Right. No, I got you. My positive and negative is that I am an entrepreneur, a serial entrepreneur. I love the creativity of a concept and a structure and seeing it through across the finish line. I've always been blessed to have that tenacity. So taking on something, that's why it's probably a good thing why I've never done drugs, because I think I probably would have taken it to the nth degree. But with gambling, when I started taking on gambling, I took it all the way to that nth degree, and just kind of embraced it. Just like trading in the markets, just like anything that I took on in my life, I went full force at it.
Yeah, tell me a little bit about how the whole ASU scandal came about, how you set that up. What was it that triggered you to want to do this?
Well, the ASU scandal happened. I was, like I said a few times here, I was at the Board of Trade. My younger brother, was attending Arizona State University. And, I was making a few bucks at a young age. I was single. I would travel back and forth from Chicago to Arizona to visit my brother. And, I would take those college kids out and spend a few bucks on them, and we all had a good time together. And those kids looked up to me. For some odd reason, they looked up to me. They thought I was on a good path in life. They thought I had everything put together. And I think for the most part, Ron, I did. Things were going good for me. And my brother was living in a apartment building off campus, and next door to him, in the apartment next door, was a shorter Jewish kid by the name of Benny Silman. Now, Benny was the entrepreneurial bookmaker on ASU's campus. And so when I went out there, I met Benny on a few occasions, and we started talking sports gambling. I opened up an account with him while I was in Chicago. I made some bets with him. I ended up beating him down pretty hard during the course of that football season in 1993. And, we developed a decent relationship, almost like a partner in crime relationship. I really wouldn't call it a friendship. But what happened at that point, I guess, Headache Smith. Headache was the point guard for Arizona State's basketball team. At that point, it was the Pac-10, not the Pac-12 that it's now. But at that point, Headache led the NCAA in minutes played, led the NCAA in three-point shots made and attempted, led the NCAA in free throw percentages, all Pac-10 defensive team. The kid was an absolute basketball stud. He dictated everything that happened on that team, and Frieder let him do it. Coach Frieder let him do it. So I guess this kid, Headache Smith, lived in that same apartment complex. And what happened was Headache, during the course of the football season, got into Benny. He got into him through his bookmaking operation, paid him a few bucks, but still, at the end of the day, still owed him over $20,000. So January rolls around, 1994, and, I've developed a pretty good relationship with Benny over the course of the football season. Benny calls me up, and, Ron, I remember that day like it was flipping yesterday. I was living right outside of Chicago. I was on the 14th floor of a pretty nice building, I was on a white portable phone inside my office, and it was like a Kodak moment in my mind. And I remember Benny calling me, and I was looking out the window, and it was snowing out that day, and everything outside was covered in snow. And he said, "Joe, I got a fix." And I had no idea what the heck he was talking about, Ron.
Joe, hold on just a second. I got to take a break here. Joe Gagliano is with us. We're talking about his very interesting book, No Gray Areas. We're going to make it a selection of the month on the Sports Byline Book Corner. We continue across the country and around the world. We've got you on America's Sports. Joe Gagliano is with us. Again, at 24, he organized and financed the multi-million-dollar Arizona State basketball point-shaving scandal. Pick up the story from there, Joe.
Yeah, no problem. So what happens was he said, "Joe, I got a fix." And I said, "Okay." And I just played it off like I knew what he was talking about, but I never really honed into it. And then finally he spelled out the letters, Ron, and as clear as I could remember anything in my 47 years, I remember him spelling the letters F-I-X. And then finally it hit me. I said, "Really?" And then he broke it down to me. He said, "Have you ever heard of Headache Smith?" I said, "No." And he told me about Headache, and he said, "Listen, Headache's into me for some $20,000 in this bookmaking operation." And I told him that the bookmaking shop that I have is owned by a organized crime family out of Chicago, and that he doesn't owe me the money, meaning Benny. He owes you this money, and you're this organized crime guy. I said, "Really?" And he bought it, and Benny said, "Yep, Joe, he bought it, and he wants to fix a couple games to pay off his debts." And that's how it all started, Ron. It's as simple as that.
It was blackmail then.
Well, you could look at it that way, or you could look at someone trying to pay off their debt. So I told Benny, "Hey, I'm interested, but I don't believe it. I want to talk to this kid." So Benny put me on the phone with him. A day or two later, I was on the phone with him, and you know what? I'll always give Headache credit because, this guy thought, for all he knew, he thought he was talking to some mob figure back in Chicago. But I'll give Headache credit because he said, "I will not lose. I will not lose any games." And I said to him, "Headache, you don't have to lose. Just don't win by more than I tell you."
When you got an individual player like that, Joe, how hard is it to control what the point spread is going to be? Because he's only one player and you got four others on the floor.
But what ended up happening, Ron, was he got the point guard. Headache was more of a shooting guard. He got the point guard on the team too, Isaac Burton. So now you look at Headache, who is the leading scorer on the team, and you look at the other guard, who really controls where the ball was going into. So they had some big men on their team. They had Mario Bennett that ended up playing for the Lakers for a little bit, and they had some talent that year. But you really controlled in Headache, you controlled the shooting, and you controlled in Headache and Isaac both where the ball went. And so if you look at that, you control probably 60% of the points that game.
Yeah, I know in the information I got, it says the truth is there's a lot more to the story than what was covered by the press and disclosed to the public. There was a lot more money that was bet in Vegas than what the government reported. When this thing started to get big, Joe, I mean, how did you keep your hands around this?
Well, I kept my hands around it, and I made that point about the money, and I'll touch on this real quick, Ron. I think personally, and I know a lot of people are going to gravitate to, gosh, the dollars involved, and it's crazy the amount of money that changed hands. And yeah, I get it. The ASU thing is the sizzle. I understand that. And when I say what the government reported wasn't accurate, it was accurate. It just wasn't the entirety of the story. So basically, I get indicted after the fourth game, and I'm fast-forwarding here, a few things, but I get indicted in 1998, 4 years after the last game, and the government indicts me on 72 counts. Now, if you look at the indictments, how the accounts are read, every bet that they were able to track equated to one count of the indictment. So if the government says, "Hey, Gagliano bet $300,000 to $500,000," and they give me 72 counts, it's pretty much irrelevant if they say Gagliano bet $3 to $5 million and they charge me with 1,000 counts. It's really nothing more than piling on at that point.
Yeah, how were you caught? Where did it break down, Joe?
It broke down about 3 years after the last game. There was a ton of speculation because the point spreads moved so much on the last two games. I think it was a 10.5 or 11-point line movement on the last game in 1994, which is still the largest point spread movement in history without any injuries. And there was a ton of speculation that happened with it, a ton of rumors floating around, but the government never really had anything concrete to go ahead and indict or make claims. A couple guys on campus, and Ron, I wouldn't know these guys if they were sitting right next to me right now, but a couple guys on campus got in trouble. One of the guys got in trouble for stealing credit cards at some nightclubs and then buying electronic equipment. Another guy got in trouble for some drugs, that he was selling some drugs around campus. And those were petty crimes. And so when law enforcement got involved in those guys' cases, they played Monty Hall, let's make a deal.
Yeah, they flipped on you.
Yeah. Well, they flipped, and they just told anything they could tell. And the ASU case had a lot more of a silver trophy for the government. And they charged us.
The thing, Joe, that I'm surprised at, and I suppose it's nothing you could have done anything about, I'm sure you wanted to have just a limited amount of people that could take advantage of this information and what was happening, but it sounds like it got out of hand because of the change in the spread on these games.
Yeah, and you know what, Ron? It was never intended to be 4 games. I mean, the deal I had with Benny when I first did it was exclusivity. It was on a Thursday-Saturday game with Oregon State and Oregon. It was Super Bowl weekend out there. The Dallas Cowboys were playing the Buffalo Bills. Well, I laid off a ton of money, not only in Vegas, but with the bookmakers on the East Coast, with the bookmakers in the Midwest. And I'll tell you what, Ron, I was just under the radar. Nobody suspected anything. And I truly thought I was done. 2 games, I made some money quietly. Nobody knew anything about it. It was cash. And I thought that was the end of it. 3 weeks later, Headache Smith calls me up directly and said, complete shock to me, and says, hey, we're playing UCLA tomorrow at home. I'm a senior. We've never beaten them before. I want to bet on myself. Can you get me down $20,000 so we could bet on myself? I could bet on myself. And, he ended up losing. They played UCLA, and I detailed it out pretty thoroughly in the book. I flew out to Arizona for that game. It was an amazing game. UCLA had Big George Zedek in the middle, the O'Banion brothers, and it was just an outstanding basketball game. And that kid Headache played as motivated as I've ever seen anyone play. And they lost. They lost it. And now Headache owed me $22,000, and he had no way to pay it.
What happened to the 2 players in the scandal?
Headache Smith got indicted with me, Ron, and got sentenced to 1 year and a day in prison. Isaac Burton pled guilty to taking money for 2 games, and he got sentenced, I believe, to 60 days or 90 days. I forget the exact number. And I'll tell you what, and I'll tell you this real candidly, and this has been a process for me to go through, is for years I was upset with that. For years I was pissed off thinking, how the heck did these guys get off with such a light sentence when really they were where the crime stopped and started? Sure, people can make the argument that, hey, I coerced them, I lured them, I waved money in front of them, and I get that argument. But for years I always said to myself, hey, I wasn't on the court. I didn't tank any free throws. I didn't not play defense. So for years I was upset with that. But you know what, Ron? Maybe it's maturity. I don't know what it is. But I grew to learn that we all got punished. You take a kid like Headache, what did he lose? Okay, he got 1 year and a day. Okay, his life went on after prison. But this kid's been he's been basically exiled from the league. He can't have a career. He lost an NBA career. You look at this kid Isaac Burton. He floated around in the IBL leagues for a little bit. Always labeled a point shaver. Always labeled a felon. So, that was a process for me to go to in terms of what they got punished with versus what I got punished with.
We've got about 35 seconds before we have to break again. When you were arrested, when you were charged, when you went to court, what did you get, Joe?
I got sentenced to 15 months. 15 months in federal prison, and you know what? In the scheme of things, it really wasn't all that bad. The guidelines for conspiracy to commit sports bribery weren't all that egregious.
Yeah, it sounds like it. I'm a little bit surprised that for something that was as large, a multi-million-dollar scandal like this, that there would not have been more.
Yep, you and I both. It was a first-time offense, and I had no priors, and I had a lot of support in the community, and that's what I got sentenced to.
Joe Gagliano is with us. This is a fascinating book with a fascinating story, and I hope you'll check it out. No Gray Areas is the name of the book, and we're going to make it again a selection of the month on the Sports Byline USA Book Corner. We continue across the country and around the world. It's nice to have you with us here on America. Joe Gagliano is with us here on Sports Byline, again talking about his book, No Gray Areas. What did you do during that period of time, a little bit over a year in prison? How did you reflect back on it?
Back at that time I was younger. That was, 15 years ago when I self-surrendered to Nellis Air Force Base in Las Vegas. And, I had, at that point, my two oldest kids were 4 and 5 years old, and I had a couple operating companies here in Arizona, and I just tried to stay busy. Just kept my head down and stayed focused. Tried to see my family as much as I could. Tried to stay focused on what was going on the outside, and just let the time pass.
But it didn't. I guess it didn't cure you from taking chances and doing things that were a little bit on the shady side. Because after you got out, you had to go back to prison again. Tell me about that. What happened?
Yeah, you know what, Ron? It's painful to hear you or anyone else think along those lines, when you use the word shady in my name, because, gosh, I've never felt that way about myself before. I was blessed when I got out of prison in 2000. I built a pretty large company, had about 500 employees, and was really doing well. When the world fell apart in 2008, I got kicked in the gut, along with a lot of other people, when the financial collapse happened. I owned a lot of real estate. There was a piece of real estate that I was just finished construction on that had a construction loan, excuse me, that I had to seek permanent financing on. And at that point, no banks were lending money. So I went ahead and brought my dad into the mix. My father and I have done business many times over in the past, and the SBA, the Small Business Administration, was the only funding option out there for us. And so my dad and I did an SBA loan together. We have done 3 of them in the past the exact same way. My dad was suffering from cancer. Now, I'm the trustee of my father's estate. I could sit here and tell you many different ways that I have the authority to sign, that my dad got fingerprinted for the loan, that my dad was well aware of everything that happened. But you know what, Ron? That would be me trying to rationalize what I did, because what I did was, at the end of the day, when the loan documents came, I allowed and authorized my father's signature to be signed on those loan documents without the proper power of attorney in place. And there's just no way to rationalize it now, because looking back, and maybe it is through maturity, or maybe it is through a process of how I wrote the book and analyzing some of the missteps that I've made in life, what I did was flat out wrong. There's either black or white, right or wrong. There is no gray. And that's really what I learned, and that's really what tripped me up again. And I got indicted in 2012. I pled guilty to 1 count of conspiracy to commit bank fraud, and I got sentenced to 30 months in prison for the second time in my life.
I know this was an experience that almost cost you your life as well, right?
Yeah, it was some really dark times there, Ron. It was bad enough that the world fell apart, and I just lost a boatload of money in that mess. I was leveraged at the wrong time and couldn't get out of my way, so to speak. And then, then I get indicted. And when you're charged with 7 counts of bank fraud, I felt really comfortable that I could beat 6 of the 7 charges. But I knew I was going to get hung up on 1. And unless I accepted responsibility with that 1 count in the eyes of the court, the mandatory prison time, if I went to trial and lost, I was looking at 10 years. So I had to plea. But once again, I want to stress, I pled because I knew it was wrong what I did. And so I pled in December of 2012. I went into the courtroom and I pled guilty, and I walked out of that courtroom a 2-time felon. And, man, I can't even put into words on this call with you about the way I felt. I mean, I was in bed for weeks, massive depression. It hit the papers. You know, I was a pariah in the business world. I still am to this day. But, you know, I woke up the first Sunday in January 2013, and I was Googling different ways to kill myself. And it was a dark time in my life, a real dark time in my life.
What are you doing now?
You know, right now, actually, Ron, I'm working for a church. I'm working for Impact Church in Scottsdale, Arizona, just doing some good things with them, trying to make a difference, trying to use these words that I wrote as a platform to help people with choices. I'm going to tell you that I wrote this book. I had a lot of free time. I wrote it in prison. It took me about 16 months to write it, and I typed it out on a 20-year-plus typewriter while I was down there. And I wrote it, Ron, with 0 aspirations of ever publishing it. I wrote it for my children. I wrote it because I have 4 kids, and I wanted my kids to know what their father was about, the choices their father made. Whereas, God forbid, I died tomorrow, I wanted my kids to understand the journey of my life.
Joe, I think you know as well as I do that when it comes to sports, when it comes to competition, when it comes to big money involved with sports, there is always going to be gambling, and we all know that it's not all going to be legal. How bad is it, particularly at the college level? Because I've had some friends that have told me about the book betting on college campuses by college students over games.
Boy, the ease, one thing you could take away from my writings, the ease of how this happened, Ron, is just astonishing. And I'm going to tell you this, that any time, and I'm firmly convinced of this, Ron, any time you're going to link money, rewards, and gambling to personal performances, you are going to have greed and corruption. There is no flipping way around it. And greed and corruption just stems from gambling. That's all it is. And you talk about, the recent stuff out there now with tennis. I mean, why is anyone shocked with that? All these individual sports, I don't think the public should be shocked at that in any way, shape, or form. You have athletes, whether it's in tennis or whether it's in MMA, that literally there's betting lines on them, and it's individual performances. And there are not a boatload of tennis players making significant money. There are not a lot of MMA guys out there that are fighting their butts off, making a significant amount of money. But yet when they walk into the ring or walk onto a tennis court, there's a betting line for them. There's a betting line for them to win, and there's a betting line for them to lose. Tell me how that doesn't creep into their subconscious.
Well, let me add something else, too. I find it hypocritical, especially for the National Football League, now to be financially involved with the fantasy sites, because you know as well as I did, they were up on Capitol Hill bemoaning the fact that when New Jersey wanted to legalize it or somebody else wanted to legalize it, they fought that thing right and left. They also didn't want to have sports teams in Las Vegas as well. Do you see the being hypocritical as well?
It's funny because that is the word right there. Hypocrisy is the word, but money always talks. You look at the NFL and that shield that they have on there. It's all about money with these people. And you look at FanDuel or DraftKings. How is that not deemed anything but sleaze and corruption? Because it might not be. There's no way. I don't want to say no way, Ron, but it's extremely difficult for a football player to fix the outcome of a game. However, it's very easy for a football player to dictate what he does in fantasy football. Now fantasy football is no longer for fun. These guys are playing it for a lifetime. These guys are playing it for a living. And so, man, I don't agree with how the heck the NFL can endorse that if their position has been from day one anti-gambling, but yet they're endorsing these outlets.
Let me ask you a question, and correct me if you think I'm wrong on this, Joe, but I think there's two vulnerabilities when it comes to gambling, particularly on sports. One is the person who is addicted to it, and that could be at any age. The other is the young person in college who believes that they're bulletproof. Am I correct in that observation?
I think you're 100% spot on.
Is there anything that can be done about that?
I just think awareness. I think the biggest thing, Ron, why I tried to write this book, I told you it was for my kids first and foremost. The second thing is to try to get through to people, mainly young athletes, mainly younger people, to understand about life choices. Because once you understand life choices, you realize that every choice you make, no matter how big or how small, will have a consequence. And you look at these young athletes in particular, once they compromise themselves, once they compromise their integrity, once they get off center, it is next to flipping impossible to get back on center. And they will pay for that price. They will pay for that way they drifted for the rest of their lives.
It's really interesting if you think about it for just a second. Athletes, say in the National Football League, are taking performance-enhancing drugs, and I've talked about this on the show before. And it was back in the 90s that the NFL came up and said if you are caught testing positive, you're going to be suspended for 4 games. And here we are many years later, and still every year we hear about a handful, if not more than a handful, of those that are being suspended for multiple games because they're doing it. Is the same thing come into play when it comes to an athlete if they want to make money and feel that they could do something like this, like point shave or cheat in some particular way in any sport?
I think it's out there, and I think it's out there a heck of a lot more than what has been known or what has been made known to the public. I think these kids that are brought up with a talent, that have an ability to play a sport and got brought on to a major university where there's money floating around, and they see it, and their attitude is, how quickly can I get it for myself? And the temptation that they're surrounded by, Ron, has just got to be so strong. And they're not mature kids. They're 19, they're 20, right. They're 21 years old. Yeah. And, it's got to be a challenge for them.
We only have about 2 minutes left. What do you want people to take away from the book, Joe?
What I want people to take away from it the most, Ron, is to stay true to yourself, to stay true to your choices, that there are no gray areas. There are no gray areas. Every choice you make will have a consequence. So if that choice is right in your mind, then you don't have to think twice about it. But if you're thinking whether or not you should do it, more than likely it's a wrong choice. It's a wrong choice. And so things are black and white, Ron. They're right or they're wrong. There's no shades of gray.
Was it hard for you to face your demons and the results of those demons?
It was a maturation process, I can tell you that much. I truly believe, and this isn't me trying to rationalize, I don't believe I had any demons. I believe I'm a man that has integrity, that made a few poor choices. And, hey, my poor choices just happened to be bigger than a few other people's poor choices, and my poor choices just happened to get a little bit more of a spotlight. But I don't believe I had demons, because in my heart I never had intentions to deceive or defraud or do anything but the right thing. It's just I drifted off of black and white and went into gray, and I paid the price for it.
We only have about 35 seconds, and you think about all the money you were making when you were young. Was it hard to give that up? And now when you take a look about what your income is and how it's so different from when you were young?
It is. And I persecute myself for that quite a bit, Ron. I wish I was a better steward. My father, as uneducated as he was, always preached to me, Joey, save 25% of what you make. Put it away for a rainy day. And I never listened. So one of the biggest things that I still regret, and one of the biggest things that I get down on myself for, is not being a better steward when times were really, really good for me.
I got to tell you, this is a fantastic book. I'm looking forward to reading it from cover to cover. And, Joe, I want to thank you for being so candid about this and so honest not only with the listeners but also with yourself, because that's the path you need to take. Thank you, Joe, very much.
Ron, I really do appreciate the time. Check out nograyAreas.com, and you could watch a whole bunch of videos on there and get some of the press information.
Okay, Joe Gagliano with us. Again, he was 24 when he organized and financed the multi-million-dollar Arizona State point shaving scandal. And if you want to check out this book, it's simply called No Gray Areas. It isn't just about the scandal. It's his personal